and Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're going to be chatting all about sleep.
My favorite thing in the world. If you don't know me that well, then you probably don't know that I could probably sleep 9 or 10 hours a night, and that's the way that I could live. I love sleeping, but we're going to talk about why sleep is actually probably the number one biohack, if you will, for fat loss results and any sort of body recomposition results. If you're trying to change the way that you look, a lot of people don't factor sleep into the equation the same way they don't really factor stress into the equation, which why wouldn't we? We spend so much of our lives asleep. Like, why wouldn't that play a role? And so we're going to break everything down into what sleep affects, how to know if you're not having good quality sleep, questions to ask yourself, and then tactical tips on how to get better sleep and practice better what's called sleep hygiene so that you can actually get better rest and see better results because of it.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this episode because I think kind of like what you're talking about is like there's a really big difference between sleep and quality sleep. So I'm really excited to kind of dive in and really, I mean, we talk about this a lot in fat loss episodes, but this can be one of the big things holding you back from reaching your goals.
Yeah. And most people won't consider it. And, I'll kind of intro us in here with a practical example of my fiance. It's actually a really good example. We were talking about it recently because he was reflecting on his fat loss phase for our wedding, which is in 5.5 weeks now. So we're both dieting, and it's going about as well as it can for me, but it's going really well for him. So basically, he used to work night shifts. Like, I met him when he was working on a night shift, and he worked nights up until literally last September was when he switched his schedule. So a good, since fall of 2018 to fall of 2021, a good 3 years of going to bed at 7 or 8 in the morning and waking up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And that does a number on the system. And early on in his night shift career, the first fat loss phase he ever did was probably 6 months after he switched to night shift. And the fat loss phase went really well because it was his first time really ever doing anything like that, tracking macros, really being diligent about nutrition, hydration, multivitamins, all that stuff. So the weight kind of fell off the first time, but the second time he did a fat loss phase in 2020 was short-lived because then everything shut down. He was like, well, I don't need to look good for anything this summer because nothing's open. So he decided to forego that fat loss phase after a few frustrating weeks of nothing really happening. And then 2021, last year, he embarked on a fat loss phase as well. And I believe what he said, and he's a big guy, so like take these numbers into consideration. I think it took him 16 to 18 weeks to lose 12 to 15 pounds. And for a guy who starts out at 260, 1% of his body weight is 2.6 pounds. So he could be losing up to 2.5 pounds a week, but he was, quarter pound here, half a pound here, just barely shaving it off. And really, like, I was there, like, he was working his ass off to do it. Now, fast forward about, I guess we're 6-7 months into, or maybe 8 or 9 into him being on a daytime schedule and getting his sleep patterns back to normal and really like just taking care of that. The same amount of weight, 12 to 15 pounds, has fallen off in the past 6 to 7 weeks for him. And like, it's the sleep that made all the difference. Like, literally, macronutrient targets the same, workouts. I think he's doing less because he hurt his MCL about a month ago. So literally doing less in the gym, moving less, eating about the same as the last diet, but just weight's falling off, all due to sleep, all due to circadian rhythms and sleep quality. So if that doesn't show you like what sleep can do, then, I don't know what will.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like we've definitely talked about Aaron's sleep in previous episodes, because I feel like we've talked about it because you
Yeah.
guys were really, really diligent with like making sure he wasn't exposed to light and like doing all the like I felt like you guys were really good. And so the fact that like even if you are like trying to take care of it as best as you can, if you're not getting good quality sleep, like it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like when he was on night shift, we were doing everything humanly possible to make that situation as good as it could be. And
Right.
it's
And
still,
it still sucked.
yeah,
It
yeah,
still makes, yeah. And I think it kind of like sheds light on like how important like our circadian rhythm in it is, and like how like going back to our roots is really, really important. That like we have all this technology and we can try to fight it and go against it, but at the end of the day, like that's what's best.
yeah. And so just a quick couple definitions for you guys if you're unfamiliar, but a circadian rhythm is basically like our biological clock of like when we are naturally programmed to wake up and to go to sleep. This is malleable, but we do have certain predispositions for particular what are called chronotypes. So chronotypes are basically, in layman's terms, are you a morning person? Are you a night owl? Like basically that's what it is. Like you have predispositions genetically or behaviorally or whatever it might be to a certain type of biological clock. And so and I won't get too far into the weeds, 6 minutes into the episode about how you can reprogram your circadian rhythm, but they are malleable, but we have predispositions for what's going to feel best for us and our biology. Whenever it's possible, we want to try to align our actual sleep patterns to what our predispositions are. But sometimes, our shift work or our career or our hours in the day that we have to be up for, it doesn't align with that. So we have to do our best. And so that's where a lot of these tips and tricks we're going to give you today are going to help you find the best case scenario for you and your sleep, regardless of, whether you're a night owl or you're a morning person. Like, how can we optimize this for you?
Yeah, and I think it's important that regardless of if you're a morning person, if you're a night owl, like whatever your tendency is, it's still best to aim for 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night. So it doesn't, I mean, of course, we don't want it during the day, like we talked about earlier. So having like a nice little window, but it's okay if you go to bed a little later and wake up later, if you go to bed early and wake up early.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's kind of the first thing that we want to touch on is like how much sleep is good. Blanket statement good, like 7 to 9 hours per night is generally recommended by most World Health Organizations and what research has deemed to be quote unquote good. I think this can be tricky for some people in terms of just conversation, because a lot of times you spit out the words, oh, you should sleep 7 to 9 hours per night. And then somebody always says, well, I sleep 5 hours a night and I'm fine. And I feel like that's my best. There are anomalies. There are people who are, programmed to sleep a certain amount and that's all they truly need. But what I push you to consider is that just because it's what you've always done and it's how you've always functioned doesn't necessarily mean that it's what's best. But what I will say is with aging comes a predisposition to sleeping a little bit less over time. So you're going to need less sleep in your 70s than you would in your 40s or 30s or 20s, especially because of all the growth and development that's happening at that point. But so you will sleep less as you get older. But if you're in your 30s or 40s and you're like, well, I only need 4 hours of sleep and that's just how I am, like, consider the fact that there may be a better optimal state for you.
I I wish I was one of those people that could
No.
thrive off of 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night, because it would just give me so much more time during the day. But yeah, I think it is really important. And I would also like consider, because I feel like if you have one night of bad sleep a week, it may not seem like that big of a deal, but it can really add up. And so you might function fine like the next day, but I feel like the second day really hits you the most. And that's what I'm feeling like today.
Today.
Yeah, I was telling Marissa before we started the podcast, I'm usually someone that gets up between 5:45 and 6:30, and I got up at 7:30 today because I stayed up too late the night prior. But just one night of not great sleep can throw a lot of things kind of out of whack for you, like your hunger hormones. So you might have your body signaling to you the next day or the day after that you're hungrier. You might feel like more brain fog. You may be more irritable and more stressed. So there's a lot of things that can happen just from like 1 to 2 hours less for the week.
Yeah. Yeah. And so basically, just kind of getting into what sleep affects then, if you're not getting either the amount or the quality within the amount of sleep that you need. And those are, I do want to emphasize both of those things. You can get 7 to 9 hours of sleep and it can be the crappiest sleep ever. And you could still have some of the effects of sleep deprivation, even if you are sleeping the right amount of hours, if a lot of the conditions are not in place. And we'll talk about what those conditions are, and what might impact what might impact quality or quantity of sleep that maybe we don't necessarily see as a direct controllable. So I want to get into that in a little bit, but just kind of what sleep affects. So like Christina said, cognition, alertness, mood is a big one, hormones and cravings. So there has been research to show that even one night of restricted sleep, I believe the study was like 8 hours was cut to 5 hours for one of the groups, led to like significant differences in the blood work and in the actual balance of hunger hormones. So leptin and ghrelin are the hormones that tell you, are you full? Are you hungry? When should you stop eating? And they were out of balance after one night of poor sleep. And so hormones can be affected, and that can lead to a lack of adherence, say with diet. And so, and as well as energy expenditure can be affected, your direct energy expenditure of like how your metabolism is functioning, but also indirect, like if you're more tired, you're more likely to be lazier and you will be more likely to expend less energy. And then if we're thinking like athletic capability, your max power output, like if you were to 1 rep max on a day after a great night of sleep versus a shitty night of sleep, guess which day you're going to have a higher number? Like most of the time, the night that you slept really, really well. So all of those things can be drastically affected. And one thing I'll say is they are affected acutely in terms of like, if you have 1 or 2 bad nights of sleep, these things will be affected in the short term. But if your sleep is chronically restricted, then all of these things will be affected chronically as well. And it usually ends up kind of establishing like a new baseline for people of like, this is now their new normal. And then they don't realize that they're functioning submaximally or, below their optimal capacity for just life. So something to consider as well, you may not notice that all these things are downregulated if you have been suffering with chronic sleep deprivation for a while.
Yeah. And I will say the other thing too, that it raises is cortisol. So your stress hormone. So the same thing that, and we have so many episodes on stress too. So that's one of the big reasons that sleep is so important, is because you don't want to live in this chronic state of chronically stressed.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's kind of it's a vicious cycle. And I'm not saying all this, we're not saying this to scare you, because like there's easy solutions to all of this. But, if you lose a night of sleep, your overall cortisol levels are going to be raised. And cortisol plays a really big role in the sleep wake cycle. So when you wake up in the morning, your cortisol should be at its highest. And when you go to bed, your cortisol level should be lower. And that's what allows you to get to sleep and fall asleep. This is why night shift is really hard on people, because it's literally trying to sleep in a pattern opposite of your cortisol levels. But basically, if you are chronically sleep deprived, and your cortisol hormone is out of balance, it is going to further impact your sleep deprivation because of that change in that hormone affecting now your sleep cycle proactively. So it is kind of like a self-fueling cycle, especially when we get into the conversation of when caffeine comes into the mix. Long story short, you wake up after a night of poor sleep, you rely on more caffeine. The caffeine keeps you up later, you get even less sleep, and then you repeat. These cycles work, in a negative sense, and they perpetuate themselves, but they also perpetuate themselves in a positive way. So we'll talk about how to make those shifts. So just, again, not saying it to scare you, but they are very, very vicious cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you think we should kind of go over like quality sleep versus just sleep?
Quality of sleep versus sleep, meaning like, how do we know?
Yeah. So like how would someone know if they're getting quality sleep or not getting quality sleep? So like the people who are saying, well, I sleep 8 hours or 9 hours every single day, but I still feel like crap. So like, well, what's wrong?
Yeah. Or like if you sleep 4 or 5 hours a night and you're like, well, I feel fine. I feel great. This is just my life and this is how I am. So yeah, I think some questions you can ask yourself, if you're maybe just unsure if your sleep is in a good spot, are the following. So, do I wake up feeling well rested? Like, do I wake up and I'm like, wow, that was a great sleep? Or like, do I wake up and feel like I didn't sleep at all? I think at some point in our lives, we've experienced both. But like, what is our general trend? One that is really hard for me is, do you snooze the alarm? Do you snooze it once? Do you snooze it twice? Do you snooze it 10 times before you wake up? And this is something, I will self-identify with the fact that I have always identified as a person who says, I can sleep 10 hours a night. And that's just me. That's just who I am. And the more that I've reflected on it, I don't think that's the case. I think I might have said this on the podcast before, but I really think it's because I am a very high output person, but that's not necessarily the way that the human body is meant to be. And so I output at a level that my body is constantly trying to recover from. And so whenever I get the chance to oversleep, my body says, yes, 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 I need it. And so I do feel like, and I've noticed a trend that every time I've said something about myself, that I could just sleep and sleep and sleep, the people that respond and say, me too, are all like type A go-getters, always foot on the gas pedal type of women. And so I'm like, there's something to this. And so I really think that if you have trouble with snoozing your alarm over and over again, and you set 6 alarms to wake up like I do, that is a sign that your body is probably a little out of balance. Maybe you're pushing more than you can recover from. And that might be okay in a temporary time frame, but it's something to take a look at in terms of just your long-term health and balance in life, which is something that I'm currently doing and working on. But that's a big one is how much do you snooze? I'll let you kind of jump in here because I know I just rambled for a bit.
Yeah. So I was going to say, or you could be like me and have a baby and you just have an alarm clock that'll wake you up and there's nothing you can do. You can't snooze it.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, so like you're saying, like if you're constantly having to snooze your alarm, the other thing is that you just briefly touched on was recovery. So like, what is your recovery like? So if you're someone who is super active and you are just like sore all the time, but you're still getting like quality sleep, or I'm sorry, you're getting enough sleep, it may not be quality sleep because your body is never actually in a position to recover fully from what you're putting it through.
Yeah, something I really like about the popularization recently of CrossFit is like and I'm not endorsing this because like I think that there's a lot of miscalculation in smartwatches, but the Whoop watch is like a popular CrossFit watch, and it basically it brings a concept to mind that I think is important in this conversation. Now, is the Whoop accurate? Probably not. Like, ignore that. But basically, it gives you a recovery score every day based on your sleep and based on your strain for the day. So your strain for the day is like, how much output did you have? Were you on your feet all day? Did you work out 3 times? Like, what did you do? And what was that strain level? And then what does your recovery look like? So it tries to gauge based on like heart rate, how good quality your sleep was. Like, that is, I'm not going to rant about that. It's probably not accurate, but it'll give you a recovery score for your sleep and it'll balance you out. It's like, what percentage are you for the day? So if you think about your sleep and your output in your day-to-day life like that, like I just described, I'm probably outputting more than I can recover from. Therefore, I will sleep more to try to make up for that. Or, vice versa, if you are not outputting a lot and, you're always waking up at 100%, maybe you sleep less because you just need a little bit less, right? Because you're not like at your stress threshold for your body. And so I think that concept paints that picture well, even though I don't love the science behind the watch.
Yeah, I think it's good. And we talk about all sort of trackers like this, like you shouldn't like live and breathe by that thing. And like, this is this number, so therefore this was absolute. So just kind of taking it with a grain of salt and just thinking this is probably fairly accurate, but probably not,
Right.
So yeah, so I have a Garmin watch and it'll tell me the same thing. Like it'll try to estimate the sleep cycles that you're in and like how much time you spent in each cycle. And like you're saying, it goes based off of like heart rate. So it's really interesting, but and this is one of the reasons we talk a lot about being in the right season for fat loss. So like, let's say you have something super busy at work. So like if you're an accountant and you're in busy season and you're literally waking up at 5 a.m, you're going to work, you come home at midnight, probably shouldn't be in a fat loss phase, or you probably shouldn't try to work out when you're not getting enough sleep, and you're probably not getting good quality sleep either. So this is one of the reasons why it is super, super important that you're recovering from what you're putting your body through. So I think that's just a really, really good reminder.
Yeah. And I think 2 things on that. Obviously we endorse working out in your busy season and making it work. I think if I can kind of put words in your mouth and say what I think you were trying to say with that, was like, don't push your workouts 120%, beyond recovery in that time frame. It's not PR season in busy season.
Yeah, it's not neglect everything.
Yeah, it's move because it feels good and gives you more energy type of a season.
Yes. Thank you for the clarification. You know exactly what I meant.
Yeah. I feel like I can read through the lines there.
Yeah. All right. So we have quality sleep. So we have, if you're getting up and snoozing the alarm, how your recovery is. What are some other signs?
Yeah. And then I think I want to come back to the watch before the next few signs. It's just the watches and the sleep stats and everything. Like, you'll get all the data on your phone from your Whoop or your Garmin or your Apple Watch on your sleep. One thing I just want to make a point towards is, if the data confirms what you already felt, then great. But if it's going against what you felt and you're changing the way you think about how you feel based on what the watch says, that is a poor direction to head. Always rely on, how do you feel in your body first, and get in tune with that. And then if the data informs that better, great. But if it doesn't, it might be a question mark. So I think just wanted to hit home the point, like, listen to your body and learn how to do that when it comes to any sort of data or device, when it comes to monitoring health signal status. But other signs would be, do you rely on naps throughout the day? Like, do you need naps? Because that is not necessarily something, it could be like behaviorally trained, of just like, maybe that's just what you did growing up and that was just a thing. But like, do you actually feel like you need them? Because that is a sign that your sleep throughout the night is not sufficient. Are you heavily reliant on caffeine? I described the cycle a little bit, but if you are having a lot of caffeine, whether you realize it or not, it will impact the quality of your sleep if it's not out of your system by the time you're going to bed. So that's really, really important to know that. And this has, if you go back to our episode with Greg Nuckols and genetics, there's people that digest caffeine very quickly. There's people that digest caffeine slowly. And if you are one of those slower digesting people with caffeine, you might have to cut off your caffeine early in the afternoon to have it out of your system by bedtime and get the quality sleep that you need. And, you don't have to do a 23andMe to find out. Like, you can rely on your body's signals to you of, are you well rested? Like, to figure out, like, maybe I should play around with this. Maybe I should see really what's going to get me the best rest.
Yeah. And so I think they typically recommend cutting off caffeine, I believe around 1 or 2 p.m. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think anything like, I've heard before 4, I've heard before 3, I've heard anything after noon is bad. Like, so I think just on average from all the different recommendations that are thrown around, like early afternoon for sure.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is just being aware of the caffeine you're consuming, like what products have caffeine in it and how much, because that's something I didn't ever really pay attention to until I started prep. Yeah, I know you have a really funny story.
We've told it like twice on the podcast.
I know, it's so funny. But I guess that's another kind of, I think that's a really cool example of like placebo effect too.
Oh yeah. Or nocebo.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, basically I visited Christina in 2020. Yeah. Like around New Year's time, 2020. And were you in contest prep at the time?
No.
Or you were just recently out of it?
Recently out, 2020. Yeah. It was like a month or 2 later.
Yeah. So basically like, she was basically downing this supplement called ABCD. And so Core Nutritionals has 2 different BCA flavored supplements. ABCs, which is just BCAAs, beta alanine, citrulline, which is a non-stimulant. There's nothing else in it except just BCAAs and like for those benefits. And then ABCD, that D stands for drive, and drive means caffeine. And so it has 100 milligrams of caffeine per scoop. And she ordered ABCD thinking that it was the same basically as ABCs, or like, what's the difference, whatever. I think I was pretty new to Core at that point.
Yeah. So it'd been like a month or 2, I feel like.
She was scooping that shit like before bed, drinking her ABCDs, like just out of her fucking gallon. And I was literally like, it was one night, she like scooped it into her drink and was like, okay, good night. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want her to just be like tossing and turning. If she feels the effects. She wakes up the next morning and I was out and I was like, hey, how'd you sleep? She was like, great. Why? And I was like, well, I have some news for you.
Fun fact.
And I told her the difference between the supplements, and she was like, damn, I've been doing like this many scoops a day. Like, that's crazy. So like, basically, was just like tripling her caffeine intake without even knowing, but was sleeping fine because she didn't know that it was in her system, or fine enough. Right.
Yeah.
It's not raise a red flag. So I think that was really interesting, but yeah, so that's what happened. It was hilarious.
Yeah. So long story short, just be careful of what you're taking, especially supplements, because like I was with a previous supplement company before, and they recommend on the serving size to have half a scoop. And, when someone puts a scoop in the scooper, everyone does a full scoop. And it was like 425 milligrams of caffeine for 1 scoop of pre-workout. And if you're having coffee, if you happen to have an energy drink, if you have a diet soda, like you could be drinking upwards of like 800 to 900 milligrams caffeine, which is pretty high.
Yeah.
So be aware of what you're taking, and also be aware of serving sizes.
Yeah, I will even say, like, I think a sneaky one for myself and for a lot of people is diet soda. Because we love soda in this household. We are not anti-diet soda whatsoever. But Diet Coke came out with a caffeine-free version. Coke Zero has a caffeine-free now. So literally anytime I am like craving like bubbly soda before bed, I'm veering towards that, or like the Sprite, all like citrus, like 7-Up and Sprites. They don't have any caffeine, Sunkissed. But like most Coke and Pepsi products do, or like Dr. Peppers and all of that have some caffeine. So if you can get the caffeine-free version for like your dinner drink, very, very, very helpful. So basically, let's see. So those were all the questions. Do you want to pause?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see.
Sorry.
Audacity in 3, 2, 1. Sorry, Shane.
Yeah.
Okay. So those were all the questions that you could ask yourself if you're unsure if you're getting good enough sleep. And I think one more thing that I wanted to hit on that's not like on our list here is maybe why you might only get 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, but feel okay. And I think that there may be certain times in our life where short stints of this is okay. For example, having a newborn, like you are biologically programmed for that to be okay.
Yeah, it is literally wild. Like if you are breastfeeding, there's something in your hormones that shortens your sleep cycles and like makes you not as tired when you have a newborn and you're sleep deprived. It is so crazy, like learning about the female body. So just putting that out there.
That's really cool. I didn't know about the hormones part.
Yeah. So I think that was one of the reasons why like my husband would wake up after we were up 2 or 3 nights and he was like, why are you fine? And I was like, I don't know, I feel great. And he was like, he was the one taking naps, even though I was up longer throughout the night. Yeah. And I literally wake up fine. And I think since having a newborn, I've taken 1 nap.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Like just evolutionary wise. Right. So that's one. I think another one that I was kind of thinking of, Alex Hormozi about, he did a reel recently where he was like, I wake up at 5 a.m. just excited to work and blah, blah, blah. And like, so he might be an anomaly, but I think in short stints, like, let's say there's something you're really excited about with work and like, you can't stop thinking about it. Or like, maybe, you know, maybe
Christmas.
Christmas or a really exciting event is coming up in your life and you just like can't stop thinking about it. So you wake up just excited for each day, like ready to tackle it. I think in short stints, you know, our bodies are programmed to like raise our alertness and our sympathetic nervous system to wake us up and be ready for those things. So if we are very excited about something, it's oftentimes our fight or flight system being like, I'm ready to go, let's do this. Right. And so, again, we've talked a lot about stress and the sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system and how that in overdrive can be bad for your health long-term. But again, it's our stress system is meant to help us adapt to stressors and overcome challenges. And so in short stints, that is like, okay. And that is great. Use that productivity, use that energy, use that time frame. But it's when that gets prolonged is when we might get into a pattern of, oh, did we go from that to now oversleeping? Are we now compensating for that time frame where we were on overdrive? And just being aware of those patterns, I think. So, you know, if you are in a time frame where you are sleeping a little bit less, and you don't have the magic postpartum hormones for it, then just be wary that, like, you know, listen to your body's signals when it's time to put that phase of your life on hold and get back to a normal sleep cycle.
Yeah, agreed. So we'll transition and now you're like, okay, I get it. Sleep is important. Like, how do I improve it? So we're going to talk about something called sleep hygiene. So again, trying to improve the quality of your sleep. So I know if you're anywhere where I am, like, it is so freaking hot, like bumping the AC down, I can just hear like the money falling out of my wallet. But keeping your room temperature cold, anywhere between 66 to 70 is recommended.
Yeah. And, you know, stay tuned for the end of this episode as well, because we're going to kind of tie all these knots together and all these open loops together of like, okay, sleep is important. Here's why. And then we're going to go through these tips. Here's what can happen when you implement these tips in terms of your results. I do want to just like touch on that a little bit of like what benefits is that going to have and just contrast there. So stay tuned towards the end if you want to hear all of that as well. But yeah, room temperature, screen time, a lot of these things you guys probably have heard before through just BuzzFeed and, just word of mouth. Like it is stuff that is preached commonly, but I don't think we can really overstate the importance. So room temperature, 66 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit is usually best, but it is relative to your external environment. So for example, Aaron's cousin lives in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's like 115 degrees right now. And for him, 75, 80 degrees in his house feels cold compared to the outside environment. And so for him, that relative change in temperature is, going from normal to cool allows him to get to sleep better. And so it may depend on your environment a little bit. So just keep that in mind. Screen time. So if you can limit how much you're staring at a screen before bed, or if you don't limit that, then wear blue light blockers, turn on night mode on your phone or on your TV. So it has that orange hue instead of the blue. That is something that if we're getting back into the conversation of circadian rhythm, the reason why our circadian rhythm programs to wake us up in the morning and have us go to bed at night, think about what the sky looks like at sunrise and during the day compared to at night. So the sun rises and we have all these blue like hues of the sky and of light coming into our eyes and into the receptors of our eyes, and eventually getting to this place in the middle of our brain called the SCN, and it programs our circadian rhythm. And when we're receiving that light, that's why everybody nowadays is like, get sunlight the first thing in the morning when you wake up, because it programs your circadian rhythm to then wake up at that time consistently. And then when you're going to sleep, the sun setting, if you can imagine like the pinks, the oranges, and like all the colors there, like those are some of the hues that the sky is emitting. And so if we get wind of that, if we're outside in the evening and we're getting that decrease in light overall, that is, again, getting to that same place in the back of our head and signaling, here's the sleep hormones, like let's release X, Y, and Z, serotonin, and all of these different things, and signaling that wind down pattern for our body. So it's biologically cued from the environment of like the light that we would naturally see, just like from the sky, into our brain to program the pattern that perpetuates waking up at the time to continue to, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The end of that sentence was just gone, but yeah, but basically that is how that works. So
sorry.
Yeah, no, if you have blue light in your eyes at night, guess what that's going to do? It's going to keep you awake, because that is a signal to wake up. The end.
Yeah. So limiting screen time, but also like the lights around your house. So start to kind of dim the lights a little bit. And it also is kind of like a cue. You're telling your body like, hey, it's time to get ready for bed. Like this is part of our kind of like wind down routine.
Yeah, both a behavioral cue and a biological cue. So the light itself is a biological cue, but the behavioral cue will also help. And you could couple these things together, because behavioral cues signal to different parts of your brain of like, hey, this is a habit that I have, and this habit leads to me sleeping. And then your body's going to start to be like, oh, this is when I'm going to get tired. And then those things will work together.
Yeah. So having a repeatable nighttime and wind down routine, I guess that kind of goes hand in hand. So having a very similar routine that you do every single day, and that also includes the time period. So if you go to bed at a certain time every single night, try to repeat that. And same thing with getting up in the morning. So that can be difficult on the weekends, because typically what happens is we stay up a little later and we sleep in a little bit later. So trying to have your weekdays and weekends be as close as possible.
Yeah. If you can, especially because like most people will try to sleep in on the weekends, and naturally, why wouldn't you want to get extra sleep? But if you can keep that wake up window within an hour of, like, if you normally wake up at 6 on the weekdays, like, can you wake up at 7 on the weekends and make that a habit? So it's not like, there's a 4-hour difference between when you wake up on the weekdays and the weekends. Is that going to be perfect? No, but like, if everything could be perfect and ideal, that's what we would do.
Yes.
And you can strive for that, and you'll make mistakes, but like, it will improve your quality of life to strive for that rather than just throwing it all out the window.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess we should have said this kind of around the screen time and lights, is having blackout curtains. So we actually utilize these in the nursery right now, because we want to, like, when he's napping, we want to make sure that there is no light in that room to signal like, hey, it's time for bed. So the other thing too is they have these really cool like circadian kind of clocks that like they start to emit light.
Oh yeah.
And they get lighter and lighter and lighter and kind of help your body naturally wake up. I don't have one, but I, like, my husband and I really, really want to get one because he's super into that stuff.
I've heard good things about it. I've had a
Yeah.
couple clients who have the alarm clocks that are light clocks instead of instead of sound.
Mhm.
It's hard for me to say that I feel like that would work for me, because right now we actually don't have any curtains up in our house.
Mm.
So we literally, our room just like lights up when the sun rises at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And I still snooze. So
Telling you, get a baby, they'll wake you up.
Oh man, or a puppy. Like that's
Yeah.
the next thing, right? Is
Yeah.
that'll be an alarm clock in and of itself.
Yeah. So blackout curtains, and then also using a weighted blanket. So right now I love to use one in the winter, but right now, God, it's so hot. So I'm not able to use one, but that can be something to utilize as well.
Yeah. Also, I was actually talking to someone recently who had a really tight budget, and their AC bill is not something that is a part of that budget to increase in the summer. And so I actually sent her a what was it? It was like a bed pad thing, like a mattress cover.
Oh yeah.
That's a cooling mattress cover where you plug it
Mhm.
in and it cools the surface of your bed. And they have weighted blankets that you can have on top of you that do that, but you also have like the bed cover. So if you can't necessarily just crank up the AC, you could get one of those or get a cooling weighted blanket or a cooling bed cover that could like simulate that temperature for you. But not, rack up the bill quite as much.
Noted. Yeah, I know that they have those, and then the super fancy ones, if they have like the cool or heat one side of bed and the other side, you can do whatever temperature. So if you have a spouse that doesn't like your same sleep temperature, that's another option.
Yeah.
And then wearing comfortable and loose clothing to bed, that can be really helpful because obviously you don't want to be uncomfortable when you're trying to sleep.
Yeah. And then we talked about this one, but exposing yourself to daylight early in the morning and just perpetuating that rhythm of show yourself to daylight, blue light in the morning, and avoid it in the evenings. And just try to keep that as regular as possible. I know that a lot of times I've heard about, how in Alaska and like towards the poles of the earth, where it's like bright all day for 24 hours, sometimes a year, and dark for 24 hours, sometimes a year, having like an actual blue light, like lamp or something to like sit with first thing in the morning can be really helpful for those types of people who just aren't getting the sunlight that they need. So that's something that, if you're in that part of the world, invest in that for yourself during those times of year. And then caffeine, already talked about caffeine, but early mid afternoon at the latest, but also pay attention to how your body digests caffeine. If you can't tell, then assess by how you wake up in the morning and what that caffeine looked like the day prior, right? If your sleep was absolute dog shit when you had coffee at 3 in the afternoon compared to when you had it at noon for the last time, then that is something to note, right? And try to, I would recommend with this sort of a thing, if you're not going to get a genetic test, which I don't think it's necessary, to figure out how you digest caffeine. Just journal it. Just be like, this night had terrible sleep. Here was my caffeine intake the day before, and just log it for the sake of seeing trends. And then once you start to see those trends, you should have a thorough understanding of what that means for you.
Yeah. So do you want to tie it all together?
Sure. So basically, a couple things that we wanted to hit on was just like, okay, so those are a bunch of tips on sleep hygiene. We talked about how poor sleep can impact pretty much every aspect of daily human life and functioning. Now, when you take care of these things, what kind of a difference can you actually see in your fat loss, in your results, in your muscle building? And all of these processes are processes that are benefited by improving your sleep. And so I'm going to lean on some literature here because it really is telling when you kind of take all of this stuff, like everything we've talked about. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen in isolation, right? Like we sleep and we also have our nutrition. We also have our training. We also have all these other variables that always are just constantly moving parts that adds up to our results. And so the best thing we can do when we want to see, does A affect B, is put it in a scientific study and see, like, if we control everything else as much as we possibly can, does this variable A impact variable B? And so sleep, we've seen in the research that in an actual study that was conducted kind of in a context like what the stuff we talk about, I believe it was either done at Bill Campbell's lab or it was reviewed by Bill Campbell's lab, and that he has kind of the physique science lab going on down there in Florida. But there was a study where there were two groups, and one group was sleep restricted and the other group was not. And everything else was the same. They had a calorie deficit custom to them. They had a resistance training protocol custom to them. And they had basically, all of the factors and the formulas were matched up so that these people should be losing body fat and losing weight. And what happened in that study was the group that had sleep restriction had a higher proportion of weight lost from their muscle and their lean mass, 60% more, in fact, and a lower proportion of their weight from fat mass. So actually 55% less body fat was lost in that fat loss phase. Again, everything else was controlled. Their nutrition, their training, like this is kind of a great example of like kind of parallel to what I talked about with Aaron, is like, you can work so hard, you can have all of your ducks in a row, but if that sleep is not there, or if it's messed up in some way, like the actual quality of your fat loss or muscle gain results are going to be impacted. And so that is just one study to illustrate like how impactful it can be to have good sleep versus poor sleep. And for detail's sake, this was 8 hours versus 5 hours. 5 hours isn't even like that little. So like if you go to bed at midnight and wake up at 5, or you go to bed at 1 and you wake up at 6 for work, like this applies to you and the results that you may or may not be seeing. So if you are kind of in that camp, it's hard to break habits that you've had for years of, I stay up gaming till 1 a.m. with my friends, or, I have nights out a few nights a week that I'm staying out till 2 or 3, or whatever it is that keeps you up and prevents you from getting the sleep that you need. I understand it all too well because I enjoy watching TV before bed, and sometimes we let it go an episode or two too far. But, when you're in particular phases of your journey, you have to ask yourself, like, could this make a measurable difference? And if so, like, how can I make some concessions with myself to make this better, not perfect, but just better, so that you can see the results that you want to see? Because all of your hard work should not be in vain when it comes to your training and your nutrition and your fat loss journey.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to wrap up on. And I have so many things just like anecdotally from like clients and myself, but I think you guys get the point.
Yeah.
Sleep is important. And, you know, if you have all these tangible takeaways and you're like, okay, but I'm going to bed at 2 a.m, like, how do I go to bed at like 9? Try just every single night trying to go to bed like 10 minutes earlier. And like 10 minutes
Yeah.
earlier, 10 minutes earlier. And eventually you might be able to move it up a couple hours and just see the difference that it makes, and play around with it. Like, you know, just with anything, you might need to figure out what works best for you in your body.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And you got to be patient with yourself when you're changing these patterns, because your circadian rhythm does not reset itself overnight. It'll usually take at least a few days if you're really diligent about it. But if you're, kind of spotty or inconsistent, like it could take a couple weeks. And so, try your best to just take baby steps. And so we recently had a client that was going to bed at 2 or 3 in the morning. We said, let's go back 30 minutes. If you can get to bed at 1:30, like that is a win. And it was such a perspective shift for that person, because they were like, oh, like I can call it a success if it's not 9 p.m. Like, oh, cool. Right. And it's almost like more motivating, because you feel like, wow, I can actually do that. So be
Right.
patient with yourself and set realistic goals and take it slow, because your sleep patterns are most likely have been ingrained for a long time, and habits around that. And it's going to take a while to undo that, just like any sort of habit change. So be patient with yourself and take those baby steps.
Yeah. Well, awesome, guys. We hope that this episode was helpful. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit. Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.